So, good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome to the second panel session for the Greek-British Shipping Forum 2021. Our panel has the ambitious goal of covering the topic of decarbonisation over the next hour and 15 minutes. Firstly, my name is Andy McCarran, and I would like to thank the entire Maritime London team and the British Embassy in Athens for the opportunity to host this exciting panel session today. I'm the Director for the Maritime Performance Services Business Unit within Lloyd's Register. I've been with Lloyd's Register for just over 2 years, joining the company as the Commercial Director in the Marine and Offshore Business Unit. Prior to joining Lloyd's Register, I've spent over 20 years in the maritime space with Sedgwick Projects, Alstom, Converteam, and finally General Electric before joining Lloyd's Register. I started professional life as a field service engineer in Korea, Singapore, and West Africa before moving into project management and then operational leadership roles around the world, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's panel. Clearly, decarbonisation is a rather broad topic. However, with the June IMO MEPC 76 happening this week and amendments due to come into force from 2023 onwards, mandating efficiency improvements for vessels over 400 gross tonnes, ship owners do not have long to understand and implement the necessary changes to their fleets to ensure compliance. The Immediate Energy Efficiency Existing Ship Index, EEXI, is a technical efficiency regulation that introduces new limitations on the amount of CO2 emitted by a vessel per capacity tonne mile. With no firm date yet confirmed, current expectations for entry into force point to November 2022, with January the 1st, 2023 being the absolute latest date for implementation according to the IMO. Our panel will be focusing on the emerging regulatory and non-regulatory incentives for emissions cuts in shipping. We'll consider ship efficiency regulations, emissions trading, industry incentives, the forthcoming transition to alternative fuels, and the knock-on effects on markets, party relationships, and contracting. I would certainly encourage you to please post your questions in the Q&A section on the platform, and we'll try to get to as many as possible during the Q&A section of the panel. Before we get to the Q&A, each of the panelists is going to provide a 5 to 10 minute presentation on their company and how each of them is helping the shipping industry transition through the changes ahead. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by 3 maritime industry experts. Firstly, Rachel Hoyland, a senior associate with the law firm Hill Dickinson. Rachel is a shipping lawyer and senior associate in the firm's Marine Trade and Energy Group, where she's practiced for the last 6 years. Previously, she was an in-house counsel with a major container line and provides expert guidance to clients in that market. Rachel's practice encompasses both contentious and commercial marine issues, assessing environmental issues. In addition, we have George Savopoulos, a marine civil engineering consultant, a marine decarbonisation consultant from Braemar LOC. George is actively pursuing his interests in decarbonisation and data analytics, driving the relevant clean energy shipping initiatives at Aquilus Braemar. George has also led the conceptualisation and development of Triton, a portal application to calculate the carbon efficiency of ships, part of their assessment for the Poseidon Principles. Lastly, we have Noel Tomlinson, who's the Senior Business Development Manager for Commercial Maritime for the UK and Europe for BMT. Noel is an incorporated engineer and active member of the Institution of Energy and Technology and the Institute of Marine Engineering Science and Technology, with over 20 years' experience in the marine industry. Noel joined BMT in 2014 and continues to use his broad technical knowledge and experience to deliver technical design and consultancy support to the commercial maritime sector, with focus and passion. Thank you and welcome to all the panelists today. So now we'll move into the presentation sections, where each of the panelists will run through and introduce themselves, provide an overview of their company, and some of the areas where they're helping the shipping industry transition through the changes that are ahead. Firstly, Rachel, the Senior Associate at the law firm Hill Dickinson, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Andy. As Andy said, I'm a shipping lawyer and senior associate at Hill Dickinson. If we could just move on to the next slide, Ollie. My work involves helping our clients to navigate and respond to incentives to decarbonise. So over the next 10 minutes, I'm going to sketch out what some of that decarbonisation landscape looks like, and I'm going to give you the headlines on some regulatory and non-regulatory incentives. So moving on, if we could, Olga. Just before we do that, a few words about Hill Dickinson. We are historically a maritime law firm. We have offices in the major maritime centres, which of course includes Greece, where we've had an office in Piraeus since 1994. We've been supporting the Greek shipping community there for almost 30 years now. Our work there is mainly with owners and clubs, but we also work with stakeholders in related industries such as oil refinery, bunker trading, and oil and gas. I myself am in London. A factor common to both our London and Greek offices is that alongside our shipping capability, we have a really strong focus on international finance. And in relation to decarbonisation, as we'll come to see, that's really quite important. Just to mention on the Greek side, our lawyers there are Greek speaking and Greek qualified. Also, although we're an English law practice in Greece, we really have that capability to work very seamlessly where matters of Greek domestic law come up, and we're working with Greek external practitioners as well. So next slide, please, Olga. Decarbonisation. What does it mean? Why does it matter? And how do these three aspects of climate, markets, and regulation impact on one another? So the first thing to say is that decarbonisation is a global topic. It's by no means limited to shipping. It's a major agenda item for all nations and sectors today. And the reason for that is the acuity of the current climate crisis. So very briefly on that, post the Industrial Revolution, there's been a hugely increased quantity of greenhouse gases emitted into the atmosphere as a result of human activities. One of the causes of that is the burning of fossil fuel, which, as we all know, has been a major factor of the shipping industry in that period. Greenhouse gases are so called because they increase the insulative properties of the atmosphere, making it trap heat, making it warmer, and leading to global warming and then consequently climate change. And by climate change, we're talking about outcomes such as extreme weather, threats to global food security, loss of low-lying coastal margins. So some really devastating outcomes there. Now, in about the same time frame that Hill Dickinson has been in Piraeus, there's been a number of international treaties that have been devised to try and address this problem. So in 1992, there was the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol, and in 2015, the Paris Agreement. So none of these international treaties directly regulate the shipping industry, which is responsible for producing almost 3% of carbon dioxide emissions annually, and so has a big role to play here. But the International Maritime Organization, which is the global regulator, has devised an initial strategy for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from shipping, and has devised and is continuing to devise rules which go to accomplishing that aim. Now, a quick point to mention here is that there are 6 greenhouse gases recognised in the international legislation. One of those is carbon dioxide. And at the moment, a lot of the conversation, a lot of the focus of action is on carbon dioxide, which is why we're talking about decarbonisation. However, we need to consider that in the wider context of reducing the emissions of all greenhouse gases, so that we don't end up in a situation where we reduce carbon dioxide emissions, but in a manner which means we increase the emissions of any other greenhouse gas. So for shipping, decarbonisation means finding a way to continue the business of shipping without producing carbon dioxide emissions and producing increasingly fewer carbon dioxide emissions. In the short term, that means reducing fossil fuel consumption, and in the longer term, that means moving to alternative means of propulsion. And there are a number of incentives and mandates coming from different directions which are driving this transition. So Olga, if we could move on, please. I'm going to start with looking at the IMO regulations. And there are regulations that relate to 4 key areas at the moment. 2 of those, or regulations relating to the top 2 areas, are already in force, and then the bottom 2, if adopted tomorrow at MEPC, then they'll come into force from the 1st of January 2023. So running from the top, there are rules in relation to the EEDI, which is the Energy Efficiency Design Index. And those rules relate to the design of ships that are yet to be built, and they're all about building efficiency into design by reference to a continually improving standard. Then there are rules that relate to the SEEMP, which is the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan. That's all about making sure that energy efficiency is an operational consideration on a day-to-day basis for the ship. Then these are the new rules that are going to come into force. We've got rules in relation to EEXI, which is the Energy Efficiency Existing Ships Index. Those rules are all about getting ships to achieve a minimum standard of efficiency. Then there's rules in relation to CII, which is the Carbon Intensity Indicator, also new. And these rules are all about a rating system for ships, so that a programme of continuous improvements can be driven. Andy's going to talk in a few moments about those last two, EEXI and CII, in some more detail. And I'll make the point that these are, of course, international level regulations. So in addition, there could be national regulations which apply also. So then moving on, Olga, please. These regulations sit in a landscape where there's a number of other incentives and pressure points for owners to decarbonise. Now, I'll speak first about the EU emissions trading scheme, because this is a little bit of a hybrid. It's a regulatory measure, but its impact is felt in markets. So what's changing here from the 1st of January 2022, so next year, upcoming very soon, emissions from shipping will fall within the ambit of the EU emissions trading scheme. And what that really means is that there's going to be a direct cost for the production of carbon dioxide emissions on voyages into or out of the EU or intra-EU. So once emissions from shipping are within the ambit of the scheme, parties will be required to buy allowances to permit to produce carbon dioxide. They'll be able to trade those allowances, and ultimately there will be fines where there's an insufficiency of allowances. Now, this has a real impact on the relationship between owners and charterers, and at the moment we are assisting a number of clients to look at their charter party terms and to work out how they need to be adapted to accommodate this. If I move then to look at the purely non-regulatory incentives, we've got an interesting cluster with the Poseidon Principles, which are a visibility initiative that came from the banks that are financing shipping, and the Sea Cargo Charter, which is a very similar visibility initiative which came from the chartering sector, and we anticipate that something similar could emerge from the insurance sector in the future as well. And these initiatives together, they're all about creating visibility of the climate alignment of the portfolio, so the greenness of the ships financed or the greenness of the ships chartered. And together, these are creating an increasingly preferential environment for greener ships. Now, that's both from the buy side, but also as that environment is built, from an owner's perspective, it should actually be increasingly preferential to be owning and operating greener ships, because they should, in theory, be easier to finance, perhaps cost a bit less to insure, and they'll be more desirable to hire out and perhaps for higher freight rates. So that's an interesting little nexus which is creating this preferential environment. If we step behind that, though, we might ask, why is it that banks or charterers or in future maybe insurance institutes are interested in the greenness of their portfolio? Well, this is because they too are answerable to their customers, their shareholders, their stakeholders. And those entities are conscious of the climate crisis. They increasingly prefer to put their money into green options. And in fact, some of them really insist on that. So customer and client demand is a really big driver here. And this really ties in also with what we're hearing from retail and from brokering. And we know that information on the greenness of tonnage is being collated because this is increasingly becoming a factor in fixtures. So lastly, I'm just going to bring it back to the ship here. A couple of points to make. There's an incentive in relation to fuel cost. So if efficiency can be improved, then of course emissions are reduced, and in tandem with that, because less fuel is being burnt, fuel costs are reduced. Fuel is quite expensive, and in the future it's predicted to be more so, as levies might be applied to level the playing field in relation to cost as new fuels come into the market, but with a higher price tag attached to them. And then lastly, asset viability. Nobody wants to have an asset which is falling behind the market, so there's an incentive there to continue to improve efficiency. That said, we do anticipate that the drive to decarbonise is going to mean that some assets will fall behind the market sooner than they might otherwise have done, which might mean there's a bit of a spike perhaps in ship disposal. However, my colleague Trudy Protopappas is the real expert in that area, and I know that she would make the point that environmental concerns do not fall away in the ship disposal situation, because regulators are increasingly clamping down on harmful practices in that realm. And so environmental concerns really are going to remain prevalent regardless. So there's quite a lot going on there. It's a fast developing landscape, and we see that our clients need support with regulation compliance, adapting their relationships and their contracts, solution implementation, and particularly the finance dimension of that. And in time, of course, there will be disputes as well, and we'll be there to support our clients with those. So I hope that's been a useful overview. I'm going to hand on now to Andy, who's going to talk in some more detail about EEXI and CII.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Rachel, for that overview. As I'd said at the offset, I'm not going to reintroduce myself, but I'm the Director for the Maritime Performance Services. So, Olga, if we can go down a couple of pages, we can kick off on Lloyd's Register and what we're up to. One more, if possible. One more page as well, please, Olga. Thank you very much indeed. Right, so where are we at the moment? And I think it really does address some of the points that Rachel has alluded to in her presentation. Our ambition is to go beyond compliance to become a trusted advisor. Clearly, I think most people know that we were founded in 1760 in a coffee shop in London. We were the world's first ship classification society. And basically all the profits that we generate from the group go to the Lloyd's Register Foundation, which is a charity which supports engineering-related research, education, and public engagement around everything that we do, including things like our Maritime Decarbonisation Hub and our Safety Accelerator, which are absolutely the heart of some of the groundbreaking work that we're looking at doing in the decarbonisation and sustainability space. And really what we're looking to do is working towards a safer, sustainable, and thriving ocean economy within our maritime business. One of the changes that we've made as an organisation is to introduce a new service line called Maritime Performance Services, which is the business unit that I'm now running. Marine and offshore is clearly our core compliance, certification, and verification business. But the reason for pulling together our Maritime Performance Services is to bring together some of our deep technical domain expertise that we have within our technical advisory services and business advisory services with some of the software and digital solutions that we have with fleet management and fleet optimization. The reason for doing this is that we really do believe that we can help our clients and the industry transition through the regulatory change and ambitions within the industry as efficiently as possible. And that's really at the heart of our ambition as an organization over the coming years as we go through these changes. Down, please, Olga. So as Rachel said, as part of the greenhouse gas strategy, the International Maritime Organization had set a target of reducing carbon intensity by 40% by 2030 and 70% by the time we reach 2050, all reductions relative to the 2018 baseline. So for maritime fleets, this means significantly reducing the fleet's carbon dioxide output. Although some of these long-term changes are necessary, as Rachel stated in her overview, the IMO also recognised the need for short-term measures to reduce the carbon intensity of shipping while still preparing for a future that will increasingly shift to alternative fuels and carbon or zero carbon emitting vessels. So the IMO's activities and objectives for reducing the use of fossil fuels through these changes and how this impacts on the industry is critical to understand. As mentioned, these changes are part of the overall greenhouse gas strategy, with an overall ambition to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% by 2050 compared with the 2008 figures. So post 2030, this will mean significant increases in efficiency and a move from fossil fuels to alternative fuels and zero carbon emitting vessels. And in the short term, ship owners and operators will need to adopt the new EEXI challenges to reduce the carbon intensity of shipping. So we can see this really around objectives from 2018 to 2050, broadly defined by IMO, and now we're getting into the specifics of 2023 to 2030 with EEXI and CIIs, and then we're looking at the longer term game of 2030 and 2050 as those activities and objectives for the International Maritime Organization. Thank you, Olga. Page down. So this is where the need for change comes in. an EEXI has been introduced by the IMO to help achieve lower emissions figures and continue to lock in existing reductions achieved by carbon intensity figures over the last couple of years by ensuring that ships are technically efficient. Previously mentioned, EEXI is expected to come into force in November 2022, with January the 1st, 2023 being the absolute latest date for implementation according to IMO. With the short-term decarbonisation measures coming into force, around 30,000 vessels will fall under its remit. Affected vessels will require the completion of a comprehensive attained EEXI calculation, with the value of that calculation needing to sit equal to or below the required EEXI set for that specific ship type and size as outlined by IMO. With the deep technical knowledge of all the ships, obviously within Lloyd's Register, we're already assisting a large number of ship owners and technical managers around the world with their EEXI calculations. And it's becoming certainly more pressure is coming on that to make sure that the technical files are produced. So certainly in the last few months, we've completed many calculations for vessels, and this is increasing rapidly as the adoption date clearly draws closer, i.e. this week, probably tomorrow. In addition to performing those calculations, we've also been helping operators understand some of the options that they have when their vessels don't meet the EEXI requirements. So basically, post that very simple assessment of attaining EEXI or EEDI, what an owner-operator has to do is then assess the number of ships that will need to catch up. And then what we do is obviously work with them, and they can, obviously look at some of these things themselves as well, around looking at the cost-effective catch-up. And that can be around, three basic things, which is the overridable power limitations, energy-efficient technologies, and lower carbon fuels. And clearly with OPL, that becomes overridable power limit, that becomes a restriction that they then will take forward into operations. Energy efficiency technologies come with a significant return on investment and net present value calculations that people have to do to look at the return on that investment. And low carbon fuels is about availability and reliability for future use of equipment. Clearly EEXI is designed older tonnage within the fleets and to potential to look at recycling, again, which Rachel then says has further implications added to that. However, I think what we also say here is very much around EEXI as the ticket to the game. So it's really looking at how do we get technically efficient ships. Then the efficiency game starts, which looks at moving from 2023 to 2030 with the operational carbon intensity measures. And that's really where we're looking at the continuous improvement of reporting measures, but also reductions in emissions during that period. So for the majority of the fleets, EEXI will not have a significant impact on the operation. As I say, it's primarily intended to target older and less efficient tonnage. At the same time, EEXI is just the first step on a much longer journey towards decarbonisation, and one that the industry as a whole needs to get ready for. So when carbon intensity indicator ratings come into force, they will have a much bigger impact on the global fleet. If a ship requires investment now, for example, in order to achieve its EEXI compliance, there's real value for the owner in looking at future CII requirements and ensuring that the investment that they make today will also deliver the benefits over the next few years once the CII comes into force in 2023, and then mandatory in probably 2026 to 2027. Page down, please, Olga. So what do we need to do? First things first, I think it is act now. Absolutely start assessing, fleets that you own, so that you can look at managing your EEXI complexity and also the risk. Basically, there's four simple steps to take. The first of which is don't wait. So definitely look to get an indicative view on the proportion of your fleets that may already comply with the draft guidelines, and also potentially the ones that don't. And that can be done relatively simplistically with EU MRV data today. So those ship or fleet assessments can be done very, very quickly to look at what the impact might be. Then step 2 is to really look at starting the calculations if they haven't already been done. So this again is where Lloyd's can help, or Lloyd's Register can help. So our experts can review all the available technical information and carry out the most accurate calculations possible. Clearly, whilst it is a single formula approach to the assessment of EEXI, it's not as totally straightforward as that, because some of the older tonnage, there may have been modifications made to the ships. So we can work with you to look at what those impacts may have been around reclassifying the EEXI as well. And then it's to really look at the improvement options that are available to come back inside the EEXI levels. And this is really about, you know, overridable power limitations, looking at some energy efficiency devices or energy saving technologies. And that can be things like Flettner rotors, air lubrication, etc. So a number of technical solutions that Noel will go into later during his presentation. And then also to prepare the technical file. And this is really the critical part for compliance, because the preparation of the technical file is what will be input to the RO to attain the EEXI verification and then issue the IEC to the ship owner. And clearly the onboard management manuals as well, so that the survey of the OPL arrangement, for example, could also be reviewed so that the IEC can be issued as well, then to ensure that the ship then meets the requirements of EEXI. So relatively straightforward process, here to help. And I think it's very much a case of, you know, understand that there is some complexity around this, but this will be coming into force, we anticipate, this week. So we'll be looking to arrange webinars next week to run people through exactly what that means in terms of any changes that are coming out of MEPC 76 this week. So if we can just go page down, please, Olga. So in summary, with these changes comes the need to take action, and timeframes are short. So all I'm going to say is thank you for listening. And let me assure you that at Lloyd's Register, we're happy to support with your immediate EEXI calculations and improvements, and also to look beyond that at the carbon intensity reductions for future years, so that you can make the right cost-effective solutions to meet the decarbonisation and sustainability requirements. As I state as well, in addition, we will be holding a webinar next week, which we'll be sending a link out to on the outcome of MEP 76, which is this week. So with that, I'm going to say many thanks again. And I think I will be handing over to George now, who will be taking us through what Aqualis Braemar is up to and LOC. So George, are you with us? Fantastic. Over to you.
Thank you. And again, my greetings to everybody. If we can have the slide deck on, we can commence. So first of all, I would like to introduce ABL, and some of you will know us as Aqualis Braemar, some of you will know us as LOC. Now we have merged, so we are a larger family of companies. Olga, if we can go to the next slide, that currently numbers 7 companies, which we can see over there. Obviously, the most relevant one to you will be ABL, which is the merger of, which includes the merger of the shipping parts of Aqualis Braemar and LOC. If we can go to the next one. As a company, we serve 3 different sectors. We are the energy and marine consultants. This is how we see ourselves, and we still maintain our deep pool of world-class experts that are happy to support you every time and anywhere you need us. If we can move to the next page, you can see we have 3 main lines of business in our company: renewables, maritime, and oil and gas, and shipping always remains at the center of our attention. If we can go to the next slide. And the benefit is that you can find us very much everywhere. I'm now presenting out of London. At the same time, we have our office in Piraeus, and we can basically serve you at 303 locations around the globe. Next slide, please. What I'm going to be talking about is after the very impressive presentation by Andy, who explained everything about the EDI, EEXI, the carbon intensity indicators, and how these are changing the landscape. I'm going to talk to you a bit about the private initiatives that help complete the decarbonization landscape. And currently we have 2 of these, and there is another one under development. The first one, that, as most of you know, is the Poseidon Principles. It's almost 2 years old at the moment, and it's all about 27 major banks that currently finance above 45% and approaching 50% of the global shipping financing, have agreed to adjust their lending procedures to incentivize decarbonization. They were soon after followed by the charterers with the Sea Cargo Charter, which is a very similar initiative on the side of the bulk charterers. And again, they want to track their own operations and report on the emissions that come out of them. The third initiative has to do with insurers, and we are expecting to see it launched in autumn this year. And again, the expectation is that it will have plenty of similarities to the other 2. Next slide, please. The basic principles that apply in the 2 existing such initiatives have to do with the assessment of climate alignment. So signatory members to those initiatives will be annually assessing the performance of their investment portfolios in the case of the finance sector, and their chartering activities in the case of charterers. The second important pillar, the second principle, is accountability, and that has to do with using reliable information to perform this assessment. And so far as the Poseidon Principles are concerned, the information comes from a copy of your submissions to the IMO DCS. For the Sea Cargo Charter, it is the noon reports that charterers hold and use the information for the assessment. The third principle has to do with enforcement, and basically the fact that compliance is enforceable contractually, and you may have seen in new lending agreements the covenant clauses that appear there, or in new charter agreements. And of course, it has to do with the commitment of the institutions, the signatory institutions, to align their activities in line with the targets they set for themselves. And the final one is transparency. So the product of these assessments, the results of each institution and the group in a whole, will be published annually for the public eye and the rest of the market to see. All these initiatives, and that's the main point, are reliant on the willingness of the institutions to be transparent. And there is a lot of push based on the interest to ESG that has come up. So we've reached a point where an investment to be attractive does not only have to yield profits, but it also has to have a very high-level social profile. It has to follow the correct governance, and it has to be friendly to the environment, responsible to the environment. And the second, of course, important point is having the reliable information to perform these assessments. And saying that with the 2 initiatives in place, you are already sharing some information, which is the information that is required to perform this assessment. But the great question that comes up is our industry sharing enough information and to enough extent? Next slide, please. And this is where it all ties well with the work we have undertaken as ABL on the matter. So with the launch of the Poseidon Principles, we identified, we liaised with owners, with financiers, and every part effectively of the shipping ecosystem, and we try to understand what the needs, what the concerns were from each side. The result, and one of the main points, was that there was a concern about what level of information is going to be shared for the assessments to be performed, and what else may happen once this data is out in the public. Thus, we built an application that ensures exactly that. So on one stage, it reassures the owner that their information is kept separate, that it is not directly accessible by the financial institution. Also, that the information that pertains to loans does not become publicly available or available to anybody, and then not even to us at LOC who are running the initiative. And then we have a system, the back end of the application, that pulls these 2 pieces and performs the calculation and only feeds back to the financial institutions the information they need to see, which is performance, and to an extent that to a form that makes sense. Next slide, please. One important point to make is that at the end, whilst when we started our journey, everybody was very reluctant in terms of sharing information. When the time came for the assessments, most owners did not even request to go through this system, and they were happy to share their data directly with the financial institutions. Not all information is as public, however, and that's why we perform due diligence assessments on emissions. It is a topic that is hot in the market, that it gets people interested. And as an independent third party, we are available and we are looking at technical specifications. We are looking at the past performance of assets in order to help owners, third parties, buyers, and investors form their investment decision on whether to acquire an asset, what the expectations are on when it should be upgraded, the potential suitability of different upgrades, and of course, in the case of new builds, the performance expectation of the proposed designs, effectively informing the new owner when they should start looking at upgrading the vessel or investing more in the vessel for environmental compliance, and so on. This is something that does gather a lot of interest, exactly because a vessel owner knows everything about how their vessel operates, but as this information is not available to third parties, there needs to be some form of providing reassurance and insight before a purchase. Next slide, please. And that brings us to the closing statement and the broader discussion about ESG. Currently, we are addressing the E part, which has to do with the environmental impact and how we are decarbonizing and cleaning the sector. However, we should be also focusing on the social side of ESG, and that's very much where the Greek shipping sector sets the gold standard in the way that it treats its employees, in the way that it gets involved and helps local communities. And we should be able to capture this contribution and highlight it for the world and potential investors to see. And also, when we look into governance, we all understand and know how solid the governance model is in most of the Greek under most of the Greek ownership. So again, it becomes a matter of transferring this into documentation and being able to present it in a form that conveys a convincing message. That was all from me. Thank you very much. And I will see all of you in the subsequent conversation.
Thanks very much, George. So now we will hand over to Noel, the Business Development Director for BMT. Noel, over to you.
Many thanks, Andrew. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's great to be with you this afternoon. So I've been with BMT for the last 7 years now. For those of you who don't know, we are a global multidisciplinary design, engineering and risk management consultancy with a core focus within the maritime sector. For this final presentation, I'd like to briefly look at energy-saving technologies, how they can form part of an effective roadmap for decarbonisation, and how us at BMT are supporting ship owners and operators with these challenges. Next slide, please, Olga. And next slide. Thank you. So BMT has specialised in vessel design, technical consultancy and engineering services for the last 35 years. We pride ourselves in providing independent technical support to our clients and enabling them to have confidence in the decisions they make for the future. We support vessel owners and operators all over the world from many different sectors and many different vessel types, which does bring with it that ability to cross-fertilise and share information across the industry, which I think is really important. Next slide, please, Alda. So we support clients with all aspects of the vessel lifecycle, providing either specialist capabilities that they don't necessarily have in-house or additional capacity by offering turnkey packages to take care of some of the challenges presented to them, like as we're discussing today, upcoming changes in regulation, whether that be ballast water that we have been dealing with or AXI. So this ranges from new build requirement definition and concept design of new vessels through to in-service support, retrofit engineering, and technical consultancy of existing vessels. And then, as we're starting to discuss already this afternoon, eventual life extension and disposal of aging tonnage and how that fits into the picture. Unsurprisingly, one of those key areas where our clients want to have confidence in their decisions that they're making is their approach to decarbonisation and their compliance with the current and upcoming emission regulations, as we're discussing this afternoon. Next slide, please, Olga. So what do we mean when we say roadmap to compliance? Well, I'm sure you're all familiar with the list of regulations. There's a list of acronyms on the left of the screen there, and Rachel and Andrew have already mentioned some of them. I think the key frequent question that we're getting from our clients is, what does that mean for me, for my ship, for my operation? And more importantly, what do I need to do about it? And I say that's where we really need to look at that roadmap. So the first step has to be the horizon scanning, as we've discussed, and understanding the upcoming regulations, both ratified and likely, and their implications, as I say, as Angela and Rachel mentioned. Then the associated regulatory indices can be applied and assessment of operational impact conducted. And I think it's important to look both vessel-specific and fleet-wide. So both of those lenses are equally important. And then we can look at operational and technical change opportunities to achieve compliance. And we've already, heard some of those wider opportunities potentially coming from George there. So then we can start to bring this together in a roadmap of potential pathways and look at the most effective way to assess those going forward. So as we all very much appreciate, we're in a current period of accelerated change within the industry, and coupled with the current economic climate, making those right decisions is absolutely key, and on the forefront of all our minds, I'm sure, this afternoon. So when it comes to emission regulation compliance, is no less true. And for example, as this afternoon we're discussing, when a gap exists between attained EEXI value and required EEXI value, as Andrew said, the technical changes in the form of installation of ESTs, energy saving technologies, a limitation of installed main engine power, and potentially operational changes may be required. Okay, so next slide, please, Olga. Energy saving technologies. So the performance of a ship can often be improved by retrofitting energy saving technologies, or ESTs. So what are we talking about there? Well, we're talking about a lot. There's a vast array that fit into that category, right from hull coatings through to sails, all with their own capital costs, estimated performance benefits, and levels of integration, complexity, which is also key. But that creates a wide spectrum to choose from. With one or a combination of ESTs potentially providing the optimized solution for compliance, it's important to determine through the use of modeling which one is right for each specific ship type, speed, route, and operational profile. And that's really important, as I'll come on to in a minute. So what are the options? Wet, warm, and windy. And I'm not talking about the British weather or even the Greek weather for that. But the three general categories we use to group marine ESTs. So wet, so we're talking about hydrodynamic efficiency technologies, primarily consisting of specialist hull coatings, propeller, pre and post-swell devices, hull line modifications and appendages, so we're looking at bulbous bows, and other waterside technologies such as micro air bubble lubrication, for example. Warm, so we're referring to waste heat recovery, so things such as organic Rankine cycles, turbo generators, so about capturing waste heat and converting it to either augment propulsion or onboard services. And then lastly, windy, so wind-based auxiliary propulsions, so we've got wing sails, Flettner rotors, or turbo sails. Now, in the time this afternoon, haven't got time to cover all of those in detail, but I'd like to take a slightly closer look at retrofitting of propulsion improvement devices. It's often a popular and effective solution, and one many of you may be considering. So they're generally considered highly reliable, safe, and they often require little or no servicing. In addition, they're normally relatively easy to retrofit and with no real system interfaces. And with a vast array available, suppliers of devices reporting fuel savings of between 4 and 10%, there are clear performance improvements. So they fall down into 3 main subcategories. So static devices, so we're looking at pre and post swell stators, ducts, nozzles, fins on hulls or rudders, rudder bulbs, or alternative rudder designs even. Dynamic devices, so we're looking at propeller boss cap fins, grimmet vane wheels, etc. And then we've also got propulsor optimization, so looking at lightweight materials, looking at contra-rotating propellers, optimizing propeller blade selection, and potentially CPPs for those not already fitted. So we found through careful analysis it's key to understanding the primary propulsion inefficiency, and then that greatly aids the selection of the appropriate technology. From that list, and we've already covered, as you know, that there's an emerging array on the market. And I say, it's really important to work out from a ship type, speed, operational route of what is the best solution for that vessel. Next slide, please, Olga. Okay, so to round up, so while the EXR requirements do not mandate that technical modifications have to be made, nor for that they prescribe which modifications should be made, it may be that this is the only realistic way of achieving compliance for some vessels. So that will be a key consideration for some. There's a wide range of energy-saving technologies available, and they are available today, and that's a key point. We're not talking about tomorrow's technology here. But they've all got their own, as I said, unique capital investment costs, performance benefits, and levels of integration complexity, and they are vastly ranging. That there's a lot of considerations there. This is definitely a growing industry in terms of energy-saving technologies and innovation, and although a number of the principles have been around for an extremely long time, technical advancements means there's many more coming to market, and they're being much more readily adopted, that we're seeing throughout the industry. As I said earlier, accurate vessel-specific modelling and analysis of ESTs is required in order to select the most effective selection, and either that being one or a combination of ESTs. And this is essential to making an informed cost-benefit decision and maximising that return on investment. EXR compliance, regulatory compliance in general, I think, is only one part of the story, however, and as we've kind of already touched on here, I think it's important that we look at it in the context of a longer-term roadmap to decarbonisation, and looking, as I said, ship-specific, fleet-wide, but also the operational business considerations, and obviously George has mentioned some of those in that presentation. And last point, and I think this kind of is demonstrated by the panel here today, but I think collaboration is going to be absolutely essential, and that's across class authorities, naval architects, the equipment providers themselves, financial insurance organisation, and charter parties, and I'm sure we'll start to have those discussions in the ongoing session. But the more we can work together, support each other and share that information, as Rachel said, the easier our road to compliance and ultimately decarbonisation will be. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed, Noel. And I'm going to ask the rest of the panelists to rejoin us now. And just on behalf of everybody, thank you very much indeed, everybody, for your presentations today. Whilst we're just waiting for the other panelists to join, Noel, I'm probably going to start with you, because we've got some questions in from the audience, which is great, which we'd encourage people to put into the Q&A on the stage. But the question is really around, and I think it builds on what you've just sort of presented in your last slide, around does the panel feel that the introduction of EEXI will facilitate an uptick in scrapping and have the environmental consequences of significant increase in scrapping being given due consideration? So Noel, do you want to try and take that one from the ESD perspective? Because I think you've put in your last slide around energy saving devices may be the only way to actually meet EEXI compliance, and we've got to look at that broader investment. But would you like to build on that?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. And it's definitely, as I say, a question that's being asked. I think we need to look, and I mean, from two angles. We've got ESTs, and as we say, I mean, that could be a way in terms of looking at life extension of existing fleet or compliance of existing fleet. So that could be a credible way. And as we start to move forward, I think we really need to look at those when we're looking at the alternative as we look at scrapping, obviously, of new vessels and building in those energy efficiencies and technologies as we're doing now. In a very different way to the vessels that were built 20 years ago that we're potentially discussing now. I think the two need to go hand in hand, and as I mentioned, I think it's part of that roadmap. I think we need to, and there are effective ways of improving current tonnage, and I say as ESTs, for example, fit very much into that. And we need to push that, but we do need to balance that roadmap with the new vessels. Bringing in those new vessels, though, as we say, does go with it in terms of retiring older tonnage into that scrappage recycling, and that is something that is very much on the agenda and being talked about, as we all know. But how we manage that and how we progress. So I think there's the financial, economic business side of how you replace and update your fleet. I think also, as we're talking about decarbonisation, there's, say, the environmental impact and factor that also we need to manage as an industry.
I'm going to build on that and come to you, Rachel. I think, and in this is around, because I think Noel's alluded to it, but it is around those changing the relationships that we have between maritime stakeholders to avoid unnecessary scrapping, for example. So do you see, the charterer-owner relationship, financiers, insurers, etc., changing?
In a broader sense in relation to decarbonisation, yes, yep. I think so. And I would say, I think what we're observing is that there's an increasing need for collaboration and for parties to communicate. So there's lots of things that are happening simultaneously that require there to be more information flow, more communication, whether that's in relation to the implementation of solutions that will help to reduce emissions, so things like maybe just-in-time arrivals, whether it's to do with compliance with the EU emissions trading scheme and sharing information about allowances, emissions, etc. And we're seeing it in a realm as well, whereby I think in the past maybe ship efficiency would have been seen perhaps as purely an owner's issue, it's all about the ship. But charterers need green tonnage, they want green tonnage. And something that we're seeing is that they are willing to be involved to drive the availability of green tonnage. So we're starting to see joint ventures emerging between owners and charterers and technology suppliers as well. Of course, there's a big financing dimension to that. And I think that is a relatively new landscape of more communication, more collaboration, and a joint approach to some of this problem solving.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rachel. Just would say to everybody, please do post questions in the Q&A section, and we'll get to those when we can. But George, I'm going to come to you now around the next question around trends emerging regarding the different vessel types and age of vessels that might not be compliant with EEXI. So around some of the work that maybe you've been doing with Triton, etc., are you seeing some of those trends coming out now?
Well, we can definitely see that there are vessel categories that are affected more from the decarbonisation indicators, at least more than others. For instance, the way we see the tanker sector is one of the best performing in terms of existing assets that can maintain compliance throughout all that. It's, we see that this may not necessarily be the same situation when we start looking into the bulk carrier sector, where we have more aging assets and so on. And there is always what I have at the back of my mind. There is always this peculiarity, this difficulty with the bulk carrier sector, that obviously to implement a lot of the energy saving technologies and upgrade the vessels and keep them in service, you need to have the land facilities that can support them. When we're talking about dual fuel situations or hybrid situations, when we talk about electrical engines or carbon capture technologies, which is something that we see going on trial at at around this time. What my concern is that when you've got vessels that have an operational model between large shipping hubs, we expect that we will see this infrastructure be materializing very quickly. When you talk about the bulk carrier that, let's say, transfers product between a small port in the developing world and somewhere else, it's more difficult. So I mean, you understand the challenge becomes that having to have larger tanks, for instance, to accommodate carbon capturing fluids, or having to recharge certain systems whilst you do not know if you will find yourself at the port with the facilities becomes a bit of an issue. And I think that this is very much the sector where we'll need to give a bit of attention, and where we can definitely have it benefit from shore-side initiatives that would support these type of vessels.
I think that's spot on. Certainly, in some of the work that we've looked at, where we've looked at EEDI from sort of, or let's say bulk carrier EEDI from 2019 MRV data, we are seeing indications of maybe 40% of the, the fleet being above EEXI limits. So to your point, we can look at overridable power limitations, and there's some, significant work that will need to be done there with owners, operators, and charterers. And I think it builds a changing relationship that we're going to have to see, that we don't, force an unnecessary scrapping of what is a key commodity market globally for it. So I think this builds on nicely, I think, to, organizations, and what are we doing, to support the transition to 2030, and what do we see as some of those biggest challenges and obstacles in the years ahead? We've alluded to some of them in terms of, strict requirements that are coming. We've alluded to some of them in terms of technology costs. What do we see as some of the biggest challenges, and how are each of the individual organizations trying to help combat those? And Rachel, we'll start with you on that question.
Sure. I think some of the challenges are perhaps in relation to turning the tide on technology. As Noel said, technology is available now, but sort of making it actually the norm and getting that change in relation to update to happen. I think once that tide turns, then there'll be momentum, and that will continue. And that transition then into the alternative fuel landscape, because that still is very unsettled as to which direction to go in, and obviously that poses challenges in terms of where to invest. But in terms of how we are supporting, we are involved in informing our clients, sharing knowledge, clarifying issues for them. We're helping to make new things possible. I alluded previously to kind of joint venture scenarios. All of that involves a lot of legal input to get all of the relationships properly aligned and apportion the risks, etc., and engage the financing. And that's a huge lubricant to then being able to make new situations come into being. So that's an area where we're providing a lot of support. And also in relation to around that, then the adjustment of contracts, the adaptation of relationships to what is an evolving and a new situation, and equally, of course, regulation compliance.
Thanks, Rachel. The same question to you, Noel, I think, in terms of biggest challenges and what BMT is up to really try and solve some of those.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think we all know where we're heading in terms of decarbonisation as the end goal. I think we can postulate around the way we get there. I think that's one of the key challenges at the moment. I think is those unknowns and dealing with them, especially when we're coming to investment in assets and in vessels, and we're working with a lot of ship owners and operators in terms of looking at new build requirements and what does a vessel for the next 20-25 years look like, how much do we invest in future proofing, how much can we see. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges for owners and operators at the moment, and navigating that. I think with that, there's a lot we can do, and I think there's a lot we need to do. And as Rachel said, in terms of looking at some of those different relationships we have, and I think that's going to be key, and that collaboration in terms of some of these enabling some of these technologies If we look at ESTs, for example, some of them are significant capital investments. If we're looking at Flettner rotors and things like that. We've also, obviously, we've got the age-old challenge of split incentive in terms of putting that capital cost on and then getting the savings from the charter party from the cargo owners. And I think we need to enable that in terms of those different relationships as we come to really accelerate these. I think in terms of B&T, I think a lot of what we do is enabling and integrating that technology. And I think when we look at, there's lots of, individual technologies out there and operational changes. It's bringing those into a one solution into a vessel, and that's where we can bring those together. As we're seeing, we're getting lots of questions as well in terms of as we start to move as well, I think more into more innovative space. As we start to move, we start to move away from the kind of traditional rules-based and more into a risk-based approach. And I think there we're finding that that's really forcing that need for class societies, for designers, for OEMs, for insurance and finances to work much closely together. I think the technical element of the business case is quite high at the moment, and that's where we're finding, I think, that the biggest requirement from our clients in terms of really that technical support with some areas of the business that probably weren't as reliant on or didn't have the amount of technical complexity a few years ago, with some of these challenges faced at the moment.
I think some great observations there around the necessity for collaboration and breaking down some of the existing silos to move the industry forward, as opposed to individual gain around some of the implications that are going to come from EEXI and CII. I think that's great. And then George, from the Aqualis Braemar side, what challenges and how are you helping?
Well, for us, there are two different levels in which we try to support the decarbonization efforts. One of them has to do with supporting the private initiatives, such as the Poseidon Principles, and basically facilitating their implementation. Try to do that in a way that is within the comfort of both the owners and the institutions that need to perform their assessment. We have done a lot of work on the Poseidon Principles. Our intention is to get involved and support the insurance sector with their initiative, which is, again, a market, a group which is very close to our normal activities at ABL. And then obviously the other side, as I mentioned, is due diligence. We like to keep on top of the developments and the regulatory framework, whilst for entities that have been in the trade for a very long time, it's something that they do have their eye on. But there is a lot of investments and there are a lot of entities that do not have the people or the access to be monitoring the regulatory framework. So that's where we step in. We can help them prioritize, let's say, the work that needs to be done in their fleet, as you pointed out earlier as well. We can look at assets and compare their past performance, see how they perform against their peers, and then use this to advise the interested party in terms of where the asset stands and how do we basically project and where we see the future of that particular asset, when we should be expecting roughly in time some investment based on the characteristics of the asset, what type of investment and at what level is it sensible for that to be, and then help people basically put down a plan on how to look and how to manage their asset in the medium and long term.
Thanks, George. Yeah, true partnering, consulting, and advising during the process. No, good approach. So another question in now, Noel. I think it's one for yourself around technology, because it's basically asking the question: given what we know, do you think that there'll be a fairly linear transition in advancing technology between now and 2030, so over the next 8 years, or will it be experimentation followed by a mad rush to meet the requirements when 2030 comes?
Great question. I think we are starting to see an uptake. I think it's a very slow uptake, and there's lots of questions around how do we accelerate the adoption of energy-saving technologies, and I think that's one key element of this. I think it's important to look at the barriers in terms of why aren't they necessarily being adopted as quickly as they may be. I think we've started to touch on some of those already. I think though, looking at those relationships and I think slightly different relationships going forward in terms of ship owners, charterers, cargo owners, I think is kind of key to that, key element of that. I think as well as we need to look at the financial side as well, and as we say, I mean, look at potentially exploring different models, and I think this is the time that we're starting to look at new technologies. We also need to look, as I say, around the financial models of how we own and operate those as well, potentially, that may have some advantages in it, I say, accelerating some of these, especially when we've got, I say, that high capital cost, and then I say the capex opex challenge that we all kind of know within the industry. I think with that, there's also the behaviour side of things, and I think we've all seen the reactions to ballast water treatment and to other past obviously regulations that have come in where we have seen that wait and see. Now we need to do something. Again, that's going to form a big part of this, but I think it will be interesting to see as we move forward how potentially those attitudes slightly change, and I think one of the key elements to that is information, and I think that often the barrier to doing nothing or the cause to doing nothing is not having that information to make an informed decision, and I think that's where we can really accelerate, hopefully within the industry, those adoptions.
It's almost that longer term thinking again, isn't it? Is not sort of, scrubbers, ballast water treatment, which is almost plasters over a problem. This is very much about looking at the longevity of shipping through the efficiency game, let's say, as we move into that. Now I'm hearing that there's been no progress at MEPC 76 this week on the International Maritime R&D Board or Fund. So that proposal has, obviously faced some significant challenges. Primarily because there's a number of commercially driven R&D funds around the world. But what I would ask, and I think, Rachel, first for yourself, because we've probably got a chance for about 2 more questions before we need to wrap up. But MEPC draws to a close tomorrow. If you were given the opportunity now to ask the regulatory decision makers one question about the operational CII, so the carbon intensity reduction requirement.
Oh, interesting. I think my question would probably go to whether there has been any conversation about whether this rating scheme is going to become visible more broadly than as between the regulator and as between the individual operator. Obviously, we've got the Poseidon Principles, Sea Cargo Charter, which are creating visibility on related metrics. But it would be interesting to see, in the way that we expect now, if we purchase a property or if we buy a white good, it's got a sticker on it which says what the efficiency rating is. Will we see that for ships? I'd be really interested to know if there's been a conversation around that.
Very good. George, same question for you.
Well, I mean, I'm equally intrigued because we have no answers to that, but I believe that generally disclosing this information, and we're not talking about operational details, but knowing how each vessel rates would help everybody making educated decisions. It would help the industry owners learn from one another. So we all know that most vessels have sister hulls, sister vessels. So by looking at what somebody else that has a very similar asset as I do is doing, and they are improving their performance, can be a good incentive for me, George, to go and try and pursue to get there. So it's I think that we cannot expect at shipping full and open access to all information, but I think that as a sector, we would benefit substantially if there was sharing of some information. And I think that the energy rating of vessels is a good way to start. The other point that's worth making whenever we talk about the CIIs and about how this influences technology is that at that point, because we are not at the point where we can be talking about carbon-free propulsion yet, we should all understand that energy efficiency, which is what will reduce emissions, at least when we're looking in the next decade, means more economy, means an asset that returns more profit. It means us consuming less fuel. So I presume that everybody on the owner side has an incentive to go into and pursue this. And in this case, it is, let's say, a happy coincidence that the private initiatives such as the Poseidon Principles or sea cargo charters or the insurers principle that's upcoming, even by a short margin, are preceding regulation on the topic because they're forming the conditions. So now we have a group that will be interested to offer attractive financing in order to get more green vessels into the fleet. We know that charters generate now market demand for these greener assets. So somebody that does invest in these greener technologies can have the reassurance at the back of their head that their asset becomes more competitive and more easily selectable. And also the contribution from the insurers initiative is also important because as we have to bring into the fleet and try all these new technologies and emerging technologies, we need to understand that most of them will not have a proven track record, and it is very important to have the entities that will underwrite this technology so that we get to see it on the fleet and see it operating under the normal conditions. And then the rest of the sector obviously can reap the benefits of that. So I think it's something that didn't look like a very easy change, but if we give it a chance, the pieces work, the pieces interlock well with each other.
Thank you very much indeed with that, and I fully agree with that. So it just leaves me to say a huge thank you to the panelists today. So to Rachel, to George and Noel for your amazing insights. And also on behalf of Maritime London as well, what I would also like to say is thank you very much indeed to the embassy in Athens, but also to everybody that's taken part in the audience today. We certainly hope that you've enjoyed both sessions. So the first session that we had this morning on sanctions, and now the session that we've just had on decarbonisation. So with that, I'm going to say that we can now go to some of the networking areas and probably hand back to Olga for the coordination aspects. But again, a huge thank you from everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.